I'm never stuck for subjects to paint. I can see potential painting subjects everywhere. It doesn't matter what subject I paint, it's how the light hits that subject that's important to me. It's the shadows, it's the lightness of the light areas and the contrast between light and dark that attracts me. It's the tonal value range, which is what I want to touch on in this video. This week I painted a rose, but it wasn't a pretty fresh rose from my garden. It was a dead and faded rose that I painted. And to me, it's just as beautiful and inspiring as a fresh rose. I want to talk briefly about tonal values in this video. Getting your tonal values correct are crucial to creating a successful painting, more so than the actual colour that you use. A tonal value is how light or how dark a colour is. The lightest tonal value on a watercolour painting is the white of the paper. The darkest tonal value will be those areas of the painting where you've used colour straight out of the tube with very little water in it. Learning to see values is a skill that you need to develop. With watercolour painting, we work light to dark, and I believe it's important to add the darks towards the end of your painting. I don't like to commit to them too early. I tend to sneak up on my darks, and I put them in gradually by layering the paint. In this video, you'll see me put a pale wash over the rose, and then I start to paint in midtones all over the petals. And then towards the end of the painting, I start adding the darkest darks. I used Arches cold pressed paper and Winsor & Newton watercolour paints. I chose soft, muted, earthy, transparent colours to help convey that aged feeling. Before I start painting, I want to show you quickly that not all colours have the same tonal value range. Lighter hues like yellow will have a smaller range than darker colours like sepia. I'll use raw sienna here and sepia because these are two of the colours I used on my rose painting. I'll start with raw sienna. I've just painted that colour onto the paper straight out of the tube. Now I'm starting to gradually add some water to the paint. I keep adding more water to make it lighter and lighter. Then I do the same thing with sepia. This is sepia straight out of the tube. And then I gradually add water until it becomes quite light. And what I can see is that sepia has a larger tonal range than raw sienna, and sepia at full strength is darker in tonal value than raw sienna at full strength. This is a good exercise to do with your paints. Get out a scrap piece of paper and make up some value range charts. Here I'm comparing the value range of the violets that I have in my painting kit. I can see at a glance that cobalt violet, which is the colour that I used up the top, is much lighter in tonal value than all of my other violets. So when you have time, make up some charts for yourself because it's a good resource to have. Okay, let's have a look at this rose painting now. This is the reference photo I took of the rose. When I did my line drawing, I tilted the angle of the rose to the right slightly, and I put a small curve in the stem so that it wasn't so straight. The first thing I want to do is get a pale wash of raw sienna over the top of the rose. I take some of the paint and I mix it with some water on my palette. The more water I use, the lighter the tone will be. Then I take that watery paint and I paint a wash of it over the top of the entire rose. This establishes my lightest tone, and this will be the tone that I compare all of the other tones to. When that was dry, I got out some burnt sienna and I painted in the centre of the rose. I try not to be too specific right at the start. I paint in the broad shapes that I can see rather than any detail at this stage. This is the shape that I'm painting in here. Then I wanted to start painting in some other shapes that I saw. So I got out some olive green and I thought I'd mix it with a touch of the raw sienna. These are Winsor & Newton colours that I'm using. This is raw sienna. And I used that colour and I started to paint in some of the petals and the different shapes that I saw. I'm working wet on dry here. While that colour was wet, I thought I'd drop in some burnt sienna to add interest. So I'm charging one colour into another here. And then I kept going. I used the raw sienna mixed with olive green, and I also used olive green on its own. So here I've got a mixture of the two. On the left hand side it's mixed with raw sienna, but here on the right hand side I'm using straight olive green. I left highlights too where I could see highlights on the reference photo. I didn't put any paint on the lighter areas. So then I kept going. I drew in where the highlighted parts were so that I knew not to put any paint there. Sometimes I worked on wet paper and other times I worked on dry paper. I worked on the wet paper up on this petal because I wanted to leave some of the lighter wash showing and I wanted soft paint edges. So here I've got a bit of raw sienna on my brush. So here you can see how I've left the lighter underwash showing and the edges of the paint are soft. In contrast, over on this side of the petal you can see some hard edges, and that's because I took the paint all the way to the edge of the water. Then I started to turn my attention to the centre of the rose. I needed to darken some areas in here. So I mixed some burnt sienna with olive green and I was hoping that that would be dark enough. I started to paint it on where I could see that it was a bit darker. But I quickly realised that I was going to need to get another darker colour out. I let that area in the centre dry and I came out to some of the outer petals and started to paint that colour on there. So each petal, each section of the rose is painted individually. Apart from when I first painted that initial wash over the top of everything. I treat it a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. I'm looking at all the different shapes and I'm trying to paint them on as I see them. I don't think of this as a rose. To me, it's a series of different shapes and different tonal values. It's up to me to piece them all together so that when I'm finished, the rose will appear as the sum of all its parts. If I speed this up, you'll see where I'm painting a section at a time. And I try not to go too dark too quickly. I know I can put more layers over the top. If I go too dark, then I've got nowhere to go with it. I find it's best to put the lightest tonal value down first and then get in all the mid-tones and then leave the darks until all of them are in. Then it's a case of adjusting things. I might need to paint another wash over something to deepen the colour, or I may need to lift a little bit of colour out where I've gone too dark. I'm constantly re-evaluating things and I'm comparing the tonal value of one shape with the tonal values of the shapes that surround it. Is this area here lighter or darker than this area? Should this area be darker than this area? These are questions I'm always asking myself as I paint. Now I'm increasing the tonal value of the final petal. Once I paint this one in, I'll have all my midtones painted in. And then I can start to darken the darkest areas and start to bring the rose to life. This one's got a shadow here on the right hand side of it. So I've got my burnt sienna mixed with olive green here. The paper is wet, so the two colours will blend together and they'll give me that soft paint edge where they meet. Okay, so now I'm ready to start putting in some of my darks. And this is what it looks like so far. I've got some mid-tone colour all over the rose. I've kept the lightest parts of the rose light with just that initial light wash covering them. Now I can start to darken the areas of the rose that I need to. I ended up getting some sepia out. The colours that I had on my palette weren't dark enough for the darkest areas of the rose. I started right in the centre. I wanted to get it painted in because I knew that it would be the most difficult area, and I simplified it as much as I could. So that's sepia that I'm using in there. Once I got the centre painted in, then I started to move outwards and I painted in all the dark areas that I saw around the centre. I approach the darks tentatively. I want to get them in where I see them, and then I can darken them when I've got them where I want them. So you can see I've darkened up that centre section, and now I'm coming in even darker. So I've got more pigment on my brush. I'm still using sepia, but I'm darkening the darks. I'm making them darker in tonal value. I've got less water mixed into my paint, so that's making the colour darker. When I start to paint in all my darks, this is also the time when I start to add some detail over the mid-tone areas. I've got my basic colour value down on the petal, but now I need to look a bit more closely at my reference photo. I look at each petal and I look for the subtle changes in tonal value that I see. I'm using the same colour that I used on the second layer of the petal. This is raw sienna mixed with olive green. So I'm layering the paint a third time now. It's got its initial light wash of raw sienna that I put on at the start of the painting. Then I put the second layer of raw sienna mixed with olive green. And now this is the third layer of that same colour, but I'm not putting this colour everywhere. I'm only painting it on those areas where I see it slightly darker on the reference photo. I can see that my shadow on the right hand side of this petal here needs to be darker. So I'm using the same colour that I painted on there first. That was a mix of the burnt sienna and olive green. And I'm painting it a second time. But I'll leave some of that lighter shadow colour showing. I won't completely cover it. I'm working on wet paper here to keep the paint edges soft. So that's given that shadow a second layer. I can see a bit of detail on this petal. There's a line running down the centre of it. I'm painting that on with olive green on the wet paper as well. Because I darkened that shadow, I can see now that I need to darken the shadow on the petal below. This is olive green now on the wet paper. I find if I darken one section, then I have to look at the section beside it or below it and see if I need to darken that area as well. I compare them to one another. How does this area here compare to that area there on the reference photo? Is it darker or is it lighter than that area that I've just painted? Or is it the same value? Here I can start to add a bit of detail as well. So there's some veins and different things showing on this petal, so I can paint those in now as well on the wet paper. And then I come back over to this petal and I start to paint some more colour on this one as well. I felt that the areas that I painted earlier aren't quite dark enough, so I'll give them another layer of paint. I'm using the same colours throughout, but I'm varying the tonal values of the colours. One colour has got many different shades. Here I'm using olive green. It can be quite light if I mix some water into it. If I want it darker, I use more pigment and less water when I pick it up from my palette. Up here on this petal, I want to darken the corner, and I also want to paint some colour along the edge. So I'm painting some water on first. I want to work on the wet paper to keep my paint edges soft. Now I've got some raw sienna. And remember, I washed all of the petals in with raw sienna, but here it's a bit darker. So I've got more pigment, less water this time. Once I get the paint where I want it, I take the paint out of my brush, and then I use my damp brush to soften the paint edges further. Along the edge here, I've got my mixture of raw sienna and olive green. I just want to deepen the colour along the edge of the petal. Here the paper's dry. Along here, I want the paint to bleed slightly. So that's a bit of water. And this time I'll use olive green on its own, so with nothing mixed with it. And I run that along the edge. And when it hits the water, the paint bleeds back in towards the centre of the petal. That gives me that soft fuzzy edge there. I painted in the stem with some olive green. I used more pigment up near the flower, but then as I worked my way down towards the bottom of the paper, I used more water mixed into the pigment so that the paint would fade away in colour. And that way most of the colour would be up near the rose where I wanted it. So here I've got more water on my brush, and I'm pulling the paint that's already on the paper down towards the bottom. And it's very, very pale. Fades away virtually to nothing. While I waited for the stem to dry, I got some more olive green and I started to darken some areas on these little leaves. So this has got more pigment. The underlying wash is olive green, and this is olive green as well, but it's got more pigment in it. The leaves and stem on the reference photo is more of a bright green, but I decided to use olive green because I wanted more muted, natural looking colours on this painting. When I was adding detail to the little leaf down the bottom, I needed some darker pigment. This is olive green. So what I did, instead of picking it up from my puddle on my palette, I picked it up where I've squirted it out on the palette. Right up here where it's darker and creamier and there's less water. And that's how I get that darker colour. When I finished painting in the leaves, I added a bit more detail to the petals. Again, I'm using olive green here. It's not too dark, I've mixed some water with it. That's a bit of burnt sienna, warming it up in places. There's only one main leaf on the painting. I wet it with water and then I painted a bit more olive green over the top. And with that, I was happy to call it finished. And there it is. I worked on it over 2 days. I did most of the work on the first day and then a couple of hours on the second day. It's important not to confuse tonal value with colour. Concentrate on the tonal values first. Work that out and then worry about colour. If you're using a reference photo to paint from, make it black and white so that you can see the darkest areas more easily. I'll do some more videos about tonal value in the future because it's really important and it's an area that I think a lot of beginners struggle with. I plan to make a full-length tutorial of this painting for my Patreon site. I'll be working on that in the weeks ahead. Thanks for watching. Please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. And I'll be back next week with another watercolour video for you. It doesn't matter what subject I paint, it's how light the subject is. No, it's how the light hits the subject. See? Light hitting the subject. I want to talk to you briefly about tonal videos in this value. Tonal videos in this value. That's what we're going to talk about today. I plan to make a full-length I plan to make a full-length class of this painting for my Patreon site. I plan to make a full-length tutorial of this painting for my Patreon site. It'll be ready, I don't know when, I'm so busy. I plan to make a full-length tutorial of this painting for my Patreon site. I'll be working on that in the weeks ahead. And here comes the motorbike. Just when she gets it right. It's important not to confuse. It's important not to confuse tonal value with colour. Do not confuse. Tonal values. Concentrate on your tonal values first. I'm confused.